Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Palacini. I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant operating under SJP Immigration Inc. I'm also an advocate and entrepreneur. So I'm tuning in, or you're tuning in today, to hear about the pervasive issue of LMIA based job fraud. Okay. And I want to bring this issue to light because, well, you're going to see all the reasons why I want to. This video isn't just for immigrants. I know a lot of the people following my channel and subscribing are immigrants, but I do want Canadians and permanent residents to watch this because a lot of Canadians, I'd say the vast majority, more than 90%, are fully unaware of the scale and the type of fraud that is happening right now. And I place an emphasis on this fraud as being very, very, very problematic for the future of Canada as a country, okay? Considering how situations are right now, and a brief introduction about myself, I got into immigration, becoming a licensed consultant because I absolutely love Canada. I love this country. It's my home, right? It's where I grew up. I've lived in 4 different provinces, and I wanted the best and brightest entrepreneurs, okay, and skilled workers from around the world to be able to contribute and grow our country and help it to become the best place in the world to start a business, to have a family, to raise a family, I should say, and to live. I believe we can. When you look at all the factors, right? I mean, without going into too much detail, Canada has the most natural resources per person probably in the entire world. Okay, we've got 25% of the world's fresh water. We've got proximity to the United States. Well, very close proximity. The longest demilitarized border in the entire world. To the largest economy. We've got access to Asia, right? Short shipping distance to Asia, short shipping distance to Europe. We have a path through the Arctic. Access to 3 oceans. Second largest or third largest uranium reserves for clean nuclear energy. We have a ton of forestry, obviously, right? With the massive boreal forest that spans probably 70 or 75% of this country. We have everything. Okay. We have a population where more than 50% have a post-secondary education, a very well-educated population. We have so many material factors that should make us the wealthiest, most productive country in the entire world. And right now, that is certainly not the case. I don't love Canada for how it is now. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Okay. Many consultants are going to oversell Canada because they have a financial incentive to do so. I love parts of Canada's past, and I love the potential of what Canada can become. And I'm not ready to call it quits yet and leave before this country's fixed. Okay, I still think it's worth fighting for. So in the past, I mean, look at as recently as 2010. It's hard to imagine for people who weren't in Canada then, but for my Canadians listening and PRs, if you're still a PR at this point, think back to that. We had the Vancouver Olympics on home turf. We swept gold at the Olympics. We got more golds than like any other country, and it was our home. We beat the Americans in hockey. We had pulled through the 2008 world financial crisis better than any other G7 country, okay, because we had Stephen Harper at the helm. Lowered our GST from 7 to 5%. The Canadian dollar at one point surpassed the value of the American dollar because we were exporting a ton of clean, ethical Alberta oil and gas and BC gas. We were really on track to becoming better, I would say, than the United States in terms of productivity and in terms of affordability and salary. Like we were on track. And then in 2015, I don't like to blame it too much on the current leadership, but we've become a socialist nightmare. They're socializing and federalizing everything, and they've squandered all this resource-based wealth. They've intervened and interfered way too much in provincial matters, into what should be local matters. Things like the Canada Dental Care Plan, they're putting it all under one big federal umbrella. That's just a big waste of money. To consider, just use this as an example. They spent $250 million on the ArriveCan app, and now they're committing to spending 8 times that amount on an AI strategy. So do you think we're going to make any progress in terms of AI development with an investment that's only 8 times more than what it cost to build ArriveCan, which is a garbage app that could be developed in a weekend by a team of highly skilled developers? Just when you look at this, the numbers and what they're investing and where that money is going, and it's creating more public sector, more government jobs, which are not as competitive, not as innovative, ever will be as private sector jobs. That's the track we're on right now. I'm of the opinion that if we do not have a change in government by the end of 2025, we're in deep trouble, and will be at maybe a point of no return, especially if we have another 4 years of this very illiberal federal government. Again, Justin Trudeau is not a liberal. He's very illiberal. He's controlling what we put online. He's controlling the hunting rifles that we can own. He's controlling what you can say online. There's a lot of things that are very un-Canadian about the current government, okay? So without ranting too much about that, that's who I am. I love this country for what it can be and for what it has been, okay? But I can't stand the way it is right now. But for some people, immigrants especially, it may still be a better option, and they may see things getting better in the future for their own personal situations. There is still a lot of people that want to come here, okay? Maybe based on our previous reputation, a lot of them get here and then they discover, wow, the roads aren't paved with gold. There are no jobs. Wow, a basement suite is $2,000 to rent. So there are a lot of challenges right now in Canada. And I think when our country is in such a problem, it's my duty, based on the industry that I work in, to really comment on one of the big problems in our immigration system is LMIA based job fraud. And I've written a letter on Twitter about it, and it's gotten a lot of views and shares and reposts and tweets. But I'd like to not read it word for word, but go through and kind of explain to the average Canadian, the average permanent resident, and even the prospective immigrant, the scale of this fraud, the 3 different types of fraud, how it's occurring, why it's occurring, and how we can put an end to it, okay? So basically the first part of the letter is I talk about how you look at the immigration website, they talk about fraud, but they talk about marriage fraud, marrying somebody they don't love, for example. They talk about document fraud, actually submitting a fake bank statement. All this stuff is crystal clear. Like, obviously you're not supposed to do that. Using a ghost consultant, and that's a very pervasive problem too. That's somebody who's acting as a regulated Canadian immigration consultant like myself, or a lawyer, and they're filling out somebody's application on their behalf. Then they're signing and declaring that they are that person when they're not, and that leads to a 5-year misrepresentation ban. So do not use a ghost consultant. But there's a lot of that warning. But there's absolutely nothing about job fraud, paying for a job offer, and a lot of, or very, very limited, I should say. It's on a couple of the provincial PNP websites as a header, like in Alberta. But it's really not prevalent on the IRCC website or on any of the forms that these immigrants are signing. Okay? So what I'd be talking about here is what I think is one of the worst perpetrators of fraud in this country, immigration fraud. And that is also the easiest for Canada to crack down on, and it's being perpetrated by immigration consultants, licensed consultants, some of them, unscrupulous Canadian employers, okay? and shady immigrants who are looking for a way to pay their way into Canada. Okay, I don't have an issue with a potential program that would allow people to pay, like invest a significant amount of capital to create 10 or 15 jobs for Canadians or PRs, and research and development, like that sort of thing. I'm not against an investor pathway. In fact, I think Canada should bring one in the same way the USA has one, because when you look at the statistics, Canada is severely deficient in business investment. Why? Well, part of the reason is because our biggest industry, unfortunately, is real estate. And real estate is through the roof. Housing unaffordability is worse. We have one of the worst housing bubbles in Vancouver and Toronto than anywhere in the world, and affordability crisis, all that stuff, okay? If you're living in Canada, you know that. You cannot deny that fact, okay? That in the past 8 years, housing has doubled. And what people need to realize is that it has increased at a rate way faster than wages. And that's the big problem, okay? So back in 2015 or something, 39% of your income could be spent on a home. It's maybe like a third, let's say. And now we're looking at 2/3 need to be spent on average. So it's doubled. Like, and that's unsustainable. You can't be spending more than 50% of your income on housing. You should not. You shouldn't even go over 40%. So these are some of the challenges we're dealing with. But what frustrates me the most is when people are, gaining admission to this country and people participating in that and earning money basically off selling PR spots and effectively selling citizenship. So to talk about this type of fraud, it is being perpetuated by licensed consultants and unscrupulous employers. Okay, and I'm going to overview how it's done, and also for Canadians listening, and this would be very useful for immigrants seeking to work in Canada, a brief overview of the ways, the two programs to obtaining a work permit in Canada, okay? So when somebody's not a Canadian or a permanent resident, the only way they can work in Canada is with a work permit as a temporary resident. And the two ways to obtaining a work permit are under 1, the International Mobility Program, or 2, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. Now, there's probably something like 4 or 5 times more work permits issued under the International Mobility Program because that involves a lot of things like Canadian interests. So free trade agreements, like an engineer can work in the United States on just a TN visa, just like an American engineer can come to Canada and work with an LMIA exempt job offer. Okay, so that's the International Mobility Program. Then there's the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, which we're going to focus extensively on. And again, so looking at things like the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. Yeah, back to, and I will talk a bit more about the IMP as well. But so there's 2 ways to obtain a work permit. And the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is specifically designed to allow employers who are facing labor or skill shortages, like they genuinely cannot find somebody for the position suitable at that wage and at the prevailing wage, to fill that position, a Canadian or a PR. So they have to apply to Service Canada, ESDC, for a labor market impact assessment, which is basically saying, hey, Service Canada, here's $1,000 for the government fee. I've done 30 days of advertising. I've advertised on Job Bank. I've done the Job Match portal. I've invited all these Canadians and PRs to apply. I've also advertised on Indigenous Job Board Canada and on Newcomers Hub Canada to target 2 underrepresented groups in the employment industry. And I've advertised for 30 days. And now I've submitted this LMIA, and here are my company documents, my payroll, and my business license that show I'm actively engaged. I'm a real genuine company. I need to hire a foreign worker. That's exactly what an LMIA application is. And it takes about 7 months to be approved. So they need the genuineness documents to show the business is operational, what operation the business is in. They need to advertise for most streams for 30 days on the Job Bank. Then they need to show, and in the application, say why they couldn't find a Canadian, or give a bit of a picture about the type of applicants and why they weren't suitable for the position and why they need to hire a foreign worker. Okay, so a lot of these jobs that you're going to see on the job bank, because most Canadians don't hire through the job bank unless they're trying to hire a foreign worker because they have to show that they've done the recruitment. Most employers you see advertising on the job bank are intending to apply for an LMIA. There is a chance that the genuine worker, the genuine employer, may find somebody and hire them and not need to apply for the LMIA, but I would say that is quite rare. So, and the reason that they're submitting their tax documents and business license to Service Canada is to show that, hey, we're genuinely an operational business and we can afford to pay this foreign worker that we want to bring from overseas or support from within Canada to work at our establishment. With the exception of a couple LMIA streams, they do not need to indicate the foreign worker's name before submitting the application. So they can, because it is an application based by the employer, okay? They need a particular occupation in their restaurant, right? They need a cook. That's what they need. That's an occupation. They need a cook. There's a role, let's say. And maybe they haven't found the cook yet, so they just apply for the LMI and say, look, I've had a hard time filling this role for a cook, and I'm located in very northern Ontario, and there's nobody willing enough to. I've had a lot of turnover. I've had people show up to the job drunk. It's just I need to hire somebody who's going to stay with me for 3 years on a closed work permit, or 2 years. So that's basically the LMIA process in a nutshell. And I talked a little bit about the LMIA exemptions before, and that's more for not labor shortages, but for things like Canadian interests, significant benefits, international agreements. So yeah, the example that if somebody's working in Canada, they can bring their husband or wife, and then their husband or wife can also work in Canada on an open work permit in most cases. Why does that make sense? Well, because why have somebody here on their own working, right? And having to rent a place on their own, and maybe they're going to be lonely, they're not going to perform as well at the job. It does make sense to keep people who are in love together, keep families together, sharing resources like there. And also in Canadian interests are like the free trade agreements, right? So the fact that Canadians reciprocal, I can go work in the United States as an engineer, an American can come work in Canada as an engineer. Canada-Colombia free trade agreement. And the international mobility program is actually pretty awesome because it's very selective. There's only it's either occupation specific or language specific for the Francophone mobility program, but it's factors that aren't really in so much control as the employer besides just giving a job offer, wanting to hire somebody. The LMIA process, on the other hand, through the temporary foreign worker program is done through Service Canada, and that LMIA is a document that's issued to the employer which says, hey, you need to hire this cook, you have the ability to hire a foreign worker, okay? And that creates some problems because it puts a lot of and you're going to see why, because this is probably the most important factor. So something like 95% of LMIAs are approved. When you look at the percent approved versus percent refused on the Open Government website, they're likely to issue a positive LMIA. When a business comes to Service Canada and says, look, I'm struggling to hire, I need a foreign worker, they're going to check a few things, but for the most part, they don't want to deny a Canadian business from hiring the labor that they say they're going to need. And I do kind of understand that, but they do need to be a heck of a lot more vigilant on the fraud, and here's why. So an LMIA that is issued in a skilled occupation has the ability to grant 50 additional points in express entry, which is where more than 50% of our economic class applicants come in through. And that's considered an offer of arranged employment. So a valid job offer. And skilled positions could be cook. It could be food service supervisor. It can be software tester. Those sorts of positions. Okay. Now, there's a lot of skilled positions. And the highest skilled positions, or senior managers, qualify for 200 CRS points. And for the average Canadian, what does that actually mean? Well, the recent general draw was around 549. The STEM draw was around 491. So let's just say to be competitive for PR in Canada, you've got to have about 500 CRS points today, depending on these weird categories like Francophone, where it drops a lot lower. If an LMIA can count for 50, that can be 10% improvement. If it can count for 200, that's a 40% improvement. It is a golden ticket, a 200-point LMIA. And a 50-point LMIA can trigger a nomination for an invitation to apply for a lot of people in express entry. It can also, of the other 50% of economic immigrants, a small portion, maybe 5,000, are business class, startup visas. But the other 100,000, the vast majority, are provincial nominees, which basically means IRCC says, look, we want to bring, and I'm not being specific on the numbers here, but this is very, very, I'd say, within 10%. We want 100,000 coming through express entry, our federal system. We want 100,000 coming through the provincial system, and then we want 5,000 for business. So that is roughly about right. We've got 450,000 spots for PR every year. A big portion are allocated to family class, which is, hey, I want to sponsor my wife. I met her when I was in the Philippines, and now, we're married. We need to have family reunification. We need to have about 50 or 100,000, whatever it is, for refugees, people seeking, refuge from, being targeted based on their political beliefs, their religion, those sorts of things, their sexual orientation. And then we have to have, though, the bulk 250,000 coming in through these economic pathways. So as I mentioned, the two main ones, the PNPs and the express entry, which are probably about 90 to 95% of the economic PR allocations, they rely so heavily on the ability to get this 50 points from an LMIA, which they constitute as an offer of arranged employment. That also, in the PNPs, a lot of the PNP programs, they're heavily dependent on job offers. So if somebody has, and the only thing that counts as a valid job offer, with the exception of working for a year on an LMIA exempt closed work permit, is an LMIA for the job, which would give you 50 points if it's skilled, or can constitute a job offer in the province or territory which you're working, and could trigger a nomination or a notification of interest to be nominated for the province, right? So there's a lot of weight and importance placed upon the points and an arranged employment in Canada. Tons. So it puts a lot of power in the hands of these employers to decide who gets to stay in Canada and who has to go. And that's where the fraud happens. Okay. So going back to this other part in my letter here, it's kind of ridiculous that just this offer of arranged employment, which an employer can get approved and just call Service Canada and put an employee's name on it, and it automatically can grant them 50 points in express entry. It's giving employers a lot of power to decide who gets to stay in this country, right? In fact, it's so ridiculous that just that LMIA, just that document, is worth 50 points if it's in a skilled occupation. And it constitutes more points than somebody who's worked in Canada for 1 year in a skilled occupation. So somebody came here on an open work permit, they worked for a year, their points aren't going to increase as much as if they had the LMIA, right? And that's a problem for me too. And that's, I'm going to explain why. The LMIA, it places so much importance on the projected job offer, right? It's on a future projection. And that's created a very lucrative fraud-based business here. And I'm going to talk about the three main types of fraud and how it works. So one is the most pervasive and awful types of fraud, and that is a non-genuine employment need. So basically, you can think about that as an employer who's operating doesn't actually need to hire a food service supervisor, like doesn't need an extra food service supervisor, doesn't need an extra cook, but thinks, you know what? I'm going to go through the LMIA process anyways. I'm going to hire this shady consultant to help me with the process. We're going to advertise for 30 days on 2 other platforms, say we couldn't find a Canadian, show our tax documents, show our business license, and explain that, you know, we're struggling to find another cook and another FSS, and Service Canada, like they do with 95% of LMIAs, are likely going to approve it. Then what we're going to do is, if we haven't found a foreigner by then, the employer then asks the consultant, hey, do you know anybody that's willing to pay a lot of money and is close to getting PR and, you know, would like to work for me? And the consultant says, yeah, you know what? I found somebody willing to pay $50,000. And that's exactly what happens. So they're basically selling this LMIA. Of course, that's not allowed. We know that that's wrong. And now they're getting an extra 50 points once they pay that money. The consultant is writing it up as a retainer agreement for a work permit only. So the consultant's helping with the immigration work, and they're able to charge whatever they want. 50,000 is a ridiculous amount of money. Clearly they're selling the PR. And then what can happen is once this applicant gets the 50 points, they could be overseas, they could be in Canada. But if they're overseas and they have a score of 470 and they get this LMIA, they could get invited on the next draw. Like they could then land in Canada as a PR on the basis of them having that job offer. Once they land as a PR, they have full mobility rights. They don't even need to go work for the employer at all. Okay. So that's a big problem for me. I find that ridiculous because then the employer actually, they could work for the employer for 2 weeks and then just quit. And they're a PR. And in doing so, they've raised the score of everybody else in the pool with that 50 bogus LMIA points. And they've pushed one person out of the queue or out of getting invited to apply, who maybe has been here working for 3 years, studied here, and is just working for an employer that doesn't want to do the LMIA process because it's actually quite invasive when they're asking for those tax documents. And a lot of companies, and large companies, don't like to do the LMIA base, right? That's hospitals or governments. They don't like to do it. They don't want to disclose they've got 6,000 people on payroll and have to provide all these documents or business license. And maybe they think it looks bad for PR because it's like, oh, they're hiring foreigners, right? So for some institutions, they just don't want to do it. And the sad thing is maybe this foreign worker who's seeking a path to PR, but they can't get one. They can't extend their work permit because they're working in their employer just doesn't want to entertain this. So that is a problematic form of fraud. And what that ends up doing is it's basically just selling out Canada. It's a very challenging type of fraud to stop because the 3 parties involved, if it all works out, it's a win-win-win, right? The consultant's charging 10 times more than they should be for a work permit application. They're charging 50 grand. The employer is probably, because they created the fake position, they're getting a kickback. They're getting a kickback from the consultant, maybe 20 grand. And the foreigner is paying the $50,000 by getting a PR, which is the next step towards Canadian citizenship, which is a fantastic passport, allows you to travel, healthcare, all the other things that being a Canadian citizen or even being a PR grant you, right? So that is what I don't like. And especially the fact that it's kicking out those who are way more deserving and unwilling to participate in these schemes. So now what happens if they sell that LMIA to that, and we're still on the same type of fraud, but what happens if they sell that LMIA, that job offer, to this person, but this person still doesn't have a score high enough, to immigrate? Well, maybe they need to work for a year in one of the PNPs under an LMIA so that they can then get an invitation to apply. Or maybe they need to gain a year of Canadian work experience to then just put them over the edge and get invited to apply. And if that's the case and the employer never really had an employment need, well, what they'll do is, yeah, even worse, charge way more, like 100 to 125,000. Explain to the foreigner, hey, look, we don't actually need this job, but we're getting you the LMIA, which is going to get you the PR if you work for a year. But don't worry, we don't actually need you to work, but we do need to pretend that you're working, and we can fake the payroll and pay stubs. And we just need the money to pay the remittances to the CRA. And we're taking a big chunk because we're doing a big favor for you. That's payroll cycling schemes, okay? Which is disgusting. So then it's basically that worker is fake working for a year, fake paying a year of remittances, and the consultant is somehow, they probably would get in a lot of trouble if they were found and audited to have quoted somebody $125,000 for a work permit. So at that point, they're probably just writing the retainer agreement for a lot lower, taking cash on the side, explaining that to this participating party. Right? And this is really, really terrible because it's everybody is complicit in it and they all have an incentive. So it's very hard to stamp out. But I do have the way for actually eliminating it. It really is. It's quite easy in my opinion. Okay? The second one, which is probably the most prevalent form because it's not as bad, right, on a numbers basis. I mean, in terms of the amount of cash changing hands, but it's still very, like, it is probably the most popular type, which is why I find it so frustrating. But that is the indirect job placement fee. So this is something to consider. So think about it. The first scenario, we had an employer who didn't need a job filled, a consultant who just wanted to make a ton of money and knew somebody that was willing to pay that, and somebody who was just looking to buy their way into Canada without going through an appropriate channel. But I also wish we had an appropriate channel like the United States, like the EB-5, right? So that's again why we probably should look at a business investor immigration pathway to facilitate and support innovation, development, growth, and job creation. All right. Now there's the indirect job placement fee, and this could be where it could be a genuine employer who needs to hire a cook, a food service supervisor, whatever. They're running a A&W at a truck stop in northern Alberta, and they just need like 5 workers that are willing to work at $17 an hour, like in the oil patch. It can offer them a path to PR down the line, so that's an exciting thing for them. But the employer's like, yeah, I just can't find Canadians and PRs willing to do this work. Which in some cases is understandable. In some cases, maybe there's just not a market need for that A&W there. Some could argue, well, raise the wages, but then are you willing to pay $25 for a burger? So there is a balance to be struck there, right? Now, this is the indirect job placement fee. And what happens is, so the LMIA process, like I mentioned, advertising, all the stuff that has to happen, a genuine consultant should be charging between $2,500 and $4,000 to secure an LMIA, like to prepare an LMIA application. They are very procedural. You have to meet the median prevailing wage. You need to advertise compliantly. Like, it's not just throw up any ad. The ad has to meet requirement specifications, the knock, everything. Everything has to be done right for that first 30 days. Then you need to prepare the documentation that shows you are in fact facing a labor or a skills shortage. Can include statistical analysis saying, hey, look, there's actually a very low unemployment rate in this region, that sort of thing, right? So there's a pronounced labor shortage, and supporting that evidence, and then submitting and waiting, okay? And then potentially having an interview with Service Canada, which could last 10 to 15 minutes. So a good consultant would charge about $2,500 to $4,000 for the LMIA application, and then maybe $250 or $500 for each additional vacancy. So let's say the guy says, I actually need 10 truck drivers or 10 food service supervisors. It's the same one LMIA application, but you're just adding positions on top of it. So that would be, yeah, just a little bit of extra money, not the full application again. Now, so they'll charge $2,500 or $4,000 for the LMIA. And then if that employer found a foreign worker, great. Then the consultant can also help with doing the work permit process, which shouldn't be more than $2,000 or $3,000 for a single work permit for a worker. But in many cases, that employer doesn't really know how to source people from overseas, and there are certain immigration requirements. Some countries take longer to immigrate from. Some countries have different standards, right? So there is an argument to have people that are knowledgeable in foreign recruitment and licensed to do foreign recruitment, which is bring people from overseas to work in Canada, okay, and recruit them for employers. And consultants, RCICs, are able to double end the deal. They are able to get paid by the employer, and they're also able to get paid by the worker or the immigrant. Problem is, there is in the code of conduct, they're supposed to disclose that a conflict of interest exists, because a conflict of interest does exist, right? Are they representing the employer in their hiring needs? Is that their best interest, or are they representing the foreign worker? Now, because there's such a supply-demand imbalance, or like a mismatch between the amount of jobs that are available in Canada for foreign workers and the amount of people that want to come work in Canada, to work in a developed country, improve their standard of living, have a path to PR, there's a huge difference, okay? So you've got to think about employers a little bit like the listing agents, the real estate listings. And that's what these consultants see, is that, okay, well, this employer needs workers. I can find these workers. Great. Now, how do you get more employers? Well, one thing you could do, and this is what happens often, very often, let's charge the employer $500 for the LMIA instead. Well, how are we going to justify that with overhead and cost to processing the LMIA application? Just pass it on to the foreign worker. Why? Because why charge them $2,000 to $3,000 for a work permit when some are willing to pay $20,000, right? That's exactly what a lot of these firms do. So they're indirectly offloading the recruitment cost onto the foreign worker. And they are able to do that because foreign workers are willing to pay $20,000. Some are, okay? Now, obviously, if the consultant goes higher at $50,000, $100,000, he's going to get really just investor types that aren't going to be able to work at the A&W genuinely. So they're eventually going to probably lose the employer as a client. So it's a fine balance, but that happens often where they're undercharging the employer, way overcharging the applicant, and they're kind of a mediator between the two. And because there's just such a high surplus of people willing to work, especially in low wage or lower skilled jobs, they really baby the employer. And then that's sad, because then they're not acting in a professional obligation like they should be to their client, to the newcomer, and basically taking advantage of the newcomer. So sometimes when there's a dispute between the newcomer and the employer, of course the consultant's going to say, look, this employer, I put 10 workers through him every year, and I'm charging them 10 to 15 grand a pop. You know, they're a $150,000 contract, versus this one guy who there's another guy willing to come take his spot, right? So that's happening a lot, and that's also challenging to stop. I've seen that a lot of consultants, they'll have two companies, one's foreign recruitment, one's immigration. They do disclose it in the retainer agreement, but it's who reads a full retainer agreement? Not a lot of people. And what ends up happening is, if they said, okay, cool, this employer wants to hire me, great, give me the LMIA, I'd like to do the work permit application on my own. The consultant ends up saying, yeah, if you're not willing to pay me for my $15,000 work permit application, I'm not going to get you an interview with the employer. That's exactly what happens, okay? And that's hard to trace, that's hard to detect, but it does happen. And it's really sad, because then what happens? You get more capitalized, less skilled, less deserving workers coming in and having a path to PR eventually. The employer not really knowing that all this is going on. They could be actually, if the foreign recruiter could be recruiting people from within Canada that are on open work permits, right? But they're not, because they're not willing to pay. They already have work status. They don't need immigration services. Why hire a Canadian or a PR, right? That might be a very good fit for this Northern Alberta A&W, for example, when you can get somebody new from overseas, bring them in, get them on healthcare, get them on a work permit so they get healthcare, their kids can come in and study here. They're not acting in the country's best interest, they're acting in their own best interest. And that happens often, and it's very challenging and hard to stop that, okay? And that is illegal. You can't force somebody to use your representation, whether it's an employer or an applicant. You can't force them to use both. And you can't withhold the documents that are property of the foreign worker that have been obtained through the employer that you've applied for a work permit. I've seen that happen where the worker then they've paid 15 grand or 20 grand. Now they're in Canada. Now they have a path to PR and they say, I need a copy of my job offer and the work permit you applied for me with as the LMIA. And the consultant says, oh, go talk to the employer. And then they talk to the employer. The employer says, yeah, I don't do any of the recruitment or anything. I don't know how to log in and access the LMIA. Get the LMIA document from the consultant. And the consultant says, it's property of the employer. But that is a lie and a misrepresentation, because if they submitted that with the applicant's work permit application, which they submitted, that is client property. So this stuff happens. And it's going to be tough to stop. It's going to be tough to end. I do have solutions for it that I think would support. One of the ways is maybe how can you break up the consultants helping employers and then consultants helping the worker? Well, honestly, there's a good for genuine consultants who charge the employer $2,500 or $3,000, and then they charge the worker $2,000 or $3,000 for the work permit. It's good to have one consultant because there's some congruency between the LMIA and the work permit, and the consultant has a knowledge of, if they are recruiting, then to find somebody who's going to maybe be able to land quicker for the employer, depending on their country of nationality, or someone specifically who the employer is looking for, and rather than someone who just gets the LMIA and then you've got somebody doing something else, and you would just have collusion then between these two entities. So I don't think we can really put an end to that. Maybe if we capped work permit fees or something, but I don't love that idea either. So if there is a way to eliminate this type of recruitment fraud and indirect charging of the job offer, I think the best way here may be through education. So the genuine employers know when they say, hey, how much should my consultant be charging my workers? Yeah, shouldn't be charging them anything north of $5,000. Okay. Obviously things matter. Maybe somebody was refused 3 times and there's ways to overcome that and they need to do more work. I get it. And that's why I don't like imposing an arbitrary cap. Everybody's situation is different. But this is now a message to the genuine employers. Make sure that you know how much your consultant's charging. Make sure you know what a fair rate is for a work permit, because if they are overcharging and they're indirectly, then you are responsible for that recruiter's actions. Okay. And you can be administratively fined through Service Canada for that. For example, there was one, I'm not going to mention the name, but it was an immigration company based in Alberta, and they were called out by the Office of Foreign Workers from the Philippines for illegally charging job placement fees, and they had an issue with $6,000. Okay. So that is an example. If you find that that company is doing exactly this type that I'm talking about, and sometimes they'll even target people from certain countries because they know those countries can afford to pay a bit more. Now, the final type I'd like to talk about is also quite prevalent, maybe the second most. So the first one, the payroll cycling, that's probably the least because it's quite bad. You're misrepresenting to the CRA in many cases. You have no genuine need. You've got a shady employer, a shady consultant, and a shady immigrant all together. Now, this is genuine jobs for modern day slaves. And what is this? And this is one where I've talked about the first two. This one is a corrupt employer and a corrupted consultant who may know what's going on, and an unsuspecting applicant. And this is like when the Canadian employer, let's say, they recognize their role as gatekeepers, to an individual's aspiration to obtaining permanent residency in Canada. The employers that, they say, let's exploit our position What can we do? We're able to apply for LMIAs. And then we can, don't hire Canadian or PR, because what you can do is you can bring in a foreign worker, hire somebody, and then just underpay them, and then tell them that if they report it, they'll get deported because they'll have nowhere to work, which is a lie. Tell them that they have no option to apply for a vulnerable workers open work permit, which they do, but it is only valid for a year as opposed to their original work permit, which is likely 2 or 3 years. So there really is no, outlet for them. And they lie and they misrepresent to these foreign workers and get people for $10 an hour. Sometimes the foreign worker is all knowing. Maybe they've paid 10 grand already. And then the employer says, you know what, you need the job offer for electrician, and the median wage for electrician in the lower mainland. Okay, it's $28 per hour. I'll tell you what, I know this is going to help your PR. I'm a smart employer. So I'll tell you what, you pay me $13,000 and I'll give you a job as an electrician. I do have a need for a job as an electrician. And then they get the LMIA approved. It helps the person. They've now applied for PR. They've got to wait maybe a year, or they're continuing to work on their work permit to obtain that Canadian experience. And then the employer says, yeah, I'm just going to pay you $20 an hour though, because I am doing you a favor. Now they're getting an electrician for much lower than market rate. Okay. And that's very bad for our labor market, obviously. So that's another one, leveraging high demand for sponsorship to engage in underpaying workers, and while simultaneously profiting from the immigration process. So they're competing then with genuine business owners who are paying the right wages and competing in the real market, and then instead bringing in immigrants that are willing to work for less, or willing to turn a blind eye to it because they're just not aware of their rights. And I can talk about how we can change the vulnerable worker stream for that and eliminate this type. So in my letter, I also talk a lot about solution finding. So yes, 200,000 LMIAs are issued every year. I would bet at least about roughly 25% have an element of fraudulent activity. I'd say maybe of that, 65% are the second scheme I talked about, the indirect job offer placement. Maybe 10 to 15% are payroll cycling and egregious fraud. And then the other remaining balance being the employer abusing the worker and getting basically much cheaper labor, real labor, at a discount under minimum wage, which is terrible. Okay, so of this, and I want to mention this because, yes, people need to understand that it's happening, and that means that maybe 50,000 people a year, maybe up to a quarter of our economic class PR applicants are these fraudulent participants, right? Or they're victims of fraud too. And perhaps the thing that frustrates me the most about the whole thing is that economic PR spots are finite every year. Okay. And something like 200 to 250,000 at this point. And it really depends upon finding the best and the brightest. And what it does when people are getting these fake 50 points or fake work experience, they're kicking out somebody who should have got an invitation to apply, who was not willing to pay for the job offer and not willing to engage in fraud, or not willing to be abused and underpaid and enslaved. Okay. So this is what we really need to change. There's over 1 million employers in Canada that could apply for LMIAs. In the study permit program, there's a couple thousand schools. I mean, you can easily deregulate a school or kick the school off the platform or blanket bring in study permit caps like they've done. With start a visa program, you've got 40 or 50 designated organizations that are able to grant this certificate that allows you to apply for PR and a work permit. But again, if one of them's committing fraud, you can shut one of them down. You highly regulate them. Employers, based upon just their payroll number and a corporation, well, anybody can spin one up and start again. So that is one of the issues. How do you now regulate and control all these employers? Well, the ones who are genuine and need it, I would argue overall, the LMIA process is just way too complicated. So the ones willing to go, even though 95% are approved, it's complex and it's 7 months, it takes a long time. The ones who are willing to go through it are the ones who are, a big portion of them are willing to commit the fraud. Okay? So same thing, when they make the tax code more complex, the only people who really benefit are the tax cheats and the ones who know and can afford to pay someone a lot of money to navigate all this tax strategy, right? So it's the working class or the honest, good people that end up suffering. And that's exactly what's happening right now. And it is a very, very big problem. So some of the solutions I've recommended, and I will recommend here, is it's very clear to me. Number one, remove the points. Remove 50 points for a skilled job offer. Remove 200 points for a senior manager. This removes the immigration potential of the LMIA, the permanent immigration potential, and get back to basics. What's it for? When an employer is facing a labor shortage. Yes, it can still get somebody a work permit in this country that could still technically be sold, but hey, the benefit of it is a lot more diminished because it doesn't give somebody that direct path to PR, the golden ticket, so to say, based upon the employer's judgment, okay? And instead, base more PR points and allocation on the applicant's past performance in Canada. Say, you know what, they've worked here for 3 years, they're earning $80K a year as a mechanic, they're in an occupation that we have a shortage in, they have a red seal trade, give them 100 points for that. These sorts of things that they are in control of and not the employer and not the consultant. That's how it should be, because then we're going to return to a merit-based immigration system, which made Canada so great. All right. So that's verifiable work experience. Then if somebody wants to immigrate and commit all this fraud, they might have to work for 3 years. They might have to get a fake red seal. Good luck getting that, right? And all these other documents. Second thing we need to do is increase public awareness. So videos like this, I like to see a minority of consultants right now speaking out against LMIA-based fraud. I see you. Thank you. I know you are. This is what we need more of. We need more people talking about the real issues that are facing the system. Everybody knows about marriage fraud. Everyone knows about, obviously, lying on a document, right? Misrepresentation, submitting a fake bank statement. Well, you shouldn't have to tell somebody that they're not supposed to do that, and they can get a 5-year ban from Canada in doing so, right? But this job placement fee, the LMIA fraud, and the shady employers, and then all this now is also deterring genuine employers from wanting to engage in it because they see how rigorous it is and procedural. Then if they are genuinely suffering a labor shortage, they don't want to do it because they say, I don't want to be associated with someone who's just hiring foreign workers for less money. That's not actually the case. They're not hiring them for less money. They're hiring them at the median wage unless they're underpaying them and engaging in that modern day slavery. Another thing, the public awareness and the warnings, every foreign worker should be signing, like every person who comes over on a work permit or is here on a work permit, if they're using a representative or if they're not, on one of their forms, it should say something like, I declare I have not paid indirectly for this job offer, right? I've read this guidance on what's fair for a work permit processing price. And I'm convinced that, I'm not being indirectly charged for the job offer. Then if people are lying and misrepresenting on that, you can use that as a reason for, stripping them of permanent residence, stripping them of Canadian citizenship if they knowingly, right, sign off on admitting that they've committed fraud, essentially. And same thing with the consultant and the lawyer and the employers. Time to give them, jail time because it's human trafficking, in my opinion. So we need tougher penalties. Another thing I think we should do, I mentioned it again, is introducing a business investment visa. We really need something where if somebody's got enough money and they're willing to create jobs, why not have them work? Why not have them be able to invest that capital as long as it was obtained through legal means to create jobs and economic activity and innovation. Canada needs it. We are suffering with business investment relative to the United States. Suffering very much so. Companies, we struggle to get to medium and large size companies here. We have oligopoly with, 5 big banks, 3 telecoms, right? We don't have a ton of banks like the US has. We don't have a ton of telecommunications companies and options and internet and that sort of thing. And so we have these large oligopolies, which aren't very innovative. Like, just look at Canadian banking, for example. And then we have a lot of startup and small companies that try and get off the ground, but then they have trouble scaling to this medium size, or they just, get bought up by an American and they go down to the States. That's exactly what happens. We need more business development in Canada, like business investment. We need more investment in things like refining, manufacturing our products, value add services in Canada, not just sending our crude oil down to the States, but refining it here, liquefying our natural gas and getting it to India, getting it to China to displace the massive emissions from their coal-fired plants and end up becoming carbon neutral overnight if we were to do so, right? Overhaul the process is something we need to do. So one thing, if you go look at the spreadsheet of LMIAs that have been approved and the NOT codes they've been approved in, it doesn't really represent a good picture of our actual economy. It shows a lot of food service supervisors, administrative assistants, and cooks, unregulated positions that are easy to bring with somebody who's, unregulated from overseas, doesn't have a red seal. What you'll notice is a shortage, a very small amount of nurses, carpenters, electricians, like the healthcare and trades. That's where our labor shortage is now. Well, part of the problem is it's tough to get licensed in those, and you need to be licensed to then get the work permit in many cases. So there's another problem in there, but they've really got to overhaul the process, because if you were to look at that spreadsheet, you'd say, oh, wow, Canada has a ton of labor shortage in business development officers, administrative assistants, cooks, right? And that's not quite the case. And by making it so burdensome for these employers, then you turn away the genuine ones. Another thing we could look at, express entry for workers. So I love the fact that express entry was, and not so much anymore, but with all the LMIA stuff, but it was in the past very, very dependent on merit base. So language, Canadian experience, English and French were treated equally in terms of economic benefit. Okay. I'd love to see like an express entry for workers, where workers are kind of able to pre-qualify or have a certain amount of credentialing, and they're kind of ready to immigrate quicker, and they're scored and ranked based upon their adaptability or things like that. I would like to see something more like that to take more power out of the hands of employers just selecting. I think employers should be able to select their workers, but I don't believe employers should be selecting people for permanent residence, right? I love the idea of decentralizing it as much as possible, because I'm, I would consider myself a libertarian. I believe in small government, right? And big people. But in that way, how we could decentralize that work to the employers wouldn't be based upon these projections. The projections are garbage. The projections are lies to ESDC, right? Base it on their history. What have they earned? How long have they been working? What sector have they been working in? Those sorts of things. Things they can fully control. Then you're allowing the employer to decide it not based on job offer, but based on actual work performance, okay? And you could bring in other ways to verify that was genuine work performed. Revise the penalties for fraud, of course. It's, they get $1,000 fine if they're doing this, or they get, they get barred from hiring in this one occupation. No. It needs to be like $250,000. It needs to be jail time for consultants. It needs to be it needs to be a human trafficking charge. It also needs to be for the immigrants that knowingly participate in these schemes and pay unlawfully and commit this sort of act. they need to be stripped of their citizenship and permanent residence because it's all founded on a misrepresentation, which it can be still in today's day, but it's next to impossible to prove that sometimes. So that's why I was mentioning we kind of need more forms and more declarations to make that happen. We also need robust protection for foreign workers. This wouldn't be an issue if we removed the points for LMIAs, because then if a foreign worker was, getting abused by the employer, they could go apply for their vulnerable open work permit, but they wouldn't be scared about potentially losing their 50 points for the job offer, right? And that's what happens. Also, a vulnerable open work permit right now, if they're facing abuse from the employer, is only issued for 1 year, which basically means they can leave the abusive employer and then go work for any employer, but only for a year. Whereas their initial work permit with that shady employer might have been issued for 3 years. So now they have a shorter amount of time to work in Canada effectively. And now they've got to go then find another employer who's willing to support them with an LMIA if they want to stay in Canada for another 3 years. And an employer in Canada, if they're doing shady recruitment through a consultant, that would rather charge somebody 50 grand from overseas rather than somebody who's been working at Burger King at $17 an hour, right? And is probably not going to be able to pay that. So that's a challenge. But would be made better if they extended the length of the vulnerable open work permit to the original length of that work permit. So if an employer wants to be a piece of shit and underpay somebody, they're going to bring this worker in, and then if they're not treating the worker well, they're going to go get an open work permit and leave. So it puts less power again in the hands of the employer. Again, we need another thing, enhanced LMIA enforcement. I find it ridiculous that the recruitment is procedural in nature. I mean, they do ask on the LMIA application how many Canadians applied, how many PRs, which, I mean, are you even allowed to ask if somebody's a citizen? I don't think you are. You're allowed to ask, are you authorized to work in Canada? But you can't ask if they're a Canadian citizen or a PR, or are they Indigenous? So this is very confusing. And that's the questions they ask on the LMIA, and how many Canadians applied, and how many were interviewed, and how many couldn't you find, and why couldn't you find them, and how many platforms do you advertise on, and why couldn't they get hired? And a lot of these employers just say one wasn't willing to relocate, one didn't have the skills, one didn't show. That's it. And they don't really follow up with, they have no way to really determine whether or not that was followed. So I would recommend that they do what the United States does for their sponsorship program and actually apply to those positions as a perfect candidate, right? Somebody based locally, somebody who has an Indigenous name, somebody who is clearly a Canadian citizen, because maybe they say where they were born on their resume, but they have all the skills. And then when you see that employer isn't actually reaching out to that resume, or reaching out to the consultant isn't reaching out, then they're just not actually doing genuine recruitment. They don't care. They already have the foreign worker lined up, and they're just not willing to hire a Canadian or a PR because they're going to make more money long term off the immigration work, or off keeping that person locked into a slave wage job, right? And that's not good. So many people would look at that as entrapment, but they do it in the US, and I think we have every right to do that here, to just verify that they are in fact actively performing recruitment and not just doing it for show and meeting that procedural requirement. So thank you for listening to my solutions, a summary of the problem, a very long summary of the problem. And I want to hear your thoughts. I mean, if you like my viewpoints, if you like what I talk about, I invite you to please like and subscribe. And if you've got any suggestions, recommendations, comments on how we can make the system better, I'm all ears. I'd love to hear you guys in the comments, and I'd love to talk about it. Okay. So in short, in closing, for me, it's just very frustrating that this is exactly what's happening, and it's gotten worse combined with all of IRCC's policies. So now IRCC has enabled people to go from visitor status to then converting to work permits while in Canada. And that's increased the amount of temporary residents we have. We've got an increase 44% in the PNP programs, okay, which are heavily dependent on a job offer. And now, really, for anybody to compete in normal express entry, the best and the brightest, they need to have this LMIA document. And there's a lot of employers that just can't do it. Like if they're working for the government, or if they're working for a large institution or a multinational company, they're very reluctant to do this sponsorship type thing. But a small like losing money, let's say Subway or pizza shop, is definitely willing to do whatever they need to do to charge $50K to add to their bottom line, right? And charge for a fake LMIA and do whatever. Okay. And I do recognize that I love the idea behind employers endorsing, because they're the free market, the genuine employers endorsing somebody's candidacy for that job. But I don't like them endorsing their candidacy for PR. Okay. I think they should be able to endorse and say, this person's worked with me for 3 years, and that shows how important they are to the Canadian economy. They've worked with me for 3 years, made on average $90K a year. This is the sector they're in, IRCC. This is the unemployment rate in that sector. There is a labor shortage there. They're making more than the average Canadian, and they will make a fantastic economic newcomer. That's what I wish they looked at, rather than saying, oh, this employer says they want to offer them a job, let's give them PR, right? So as a Canadian, like, this issue really hits home for me, because, you know, what really frustrates me the most is that these people are driven by the financial incentive, and they are selling out Canada. Okay. And I love this country for what it has been in the past, for what it can be in the future. Okay. But not for how it is right now. And the saddest part of it is that there are genuine people unwilling to pay and participate in these fraudulent schemes that we, IRCC, has sent home. Oh, your status expired. Bye-bye. And who's getting the status? Somebody who's paying 40 or 50 grand, or some employer who's underpaying and getting slave wage labor, or some shady consultant who, instead of supporting the people in Canada that need a job, and somebody who is in, you know, London, Ontario as a foreigner or on an open work permit, and they're willing to relocate to Calgary, and they're willing to accept an LMIA, and they're willing to work for this employer. But you know what? They're just not willing to pay $15,000 for the work permit. So this guy's going and bringing somebody else from overseas, another person here on the healthcare system, and contributing and increasing the demands on our services, which we really can't have a lot of right now because there's a lot of pressure on them. Okay. And for long, Canada's been celebrated as having one of the best merit-based immigration systems, and I would like to get back to that, okay? So that's why I wanted to talk about this today, summarize the letter that I've sent. I'll put a link in it in my description. I want to hear your thoughts, okay? If you're a Canadian and you tuned into this and you listened to this, great, fantastic. You've learned about the fraud that maybe 95% of Canadians actually are totally unaware of. And if you want to see all the LMIAs that people are attempting to apply for, just go on to jobbank.gc.ca and see all the positions posted. I can't say they're all not genuine, okay? But if you're looking for a job in Canada and you're a Canadian or a PR and you go and apply to those, and you're qualified and they're not getting back to you, and you're based locally and you're emailing them and you're calling them, it's a very good chance that they're not genuinely recruiting for labor need, but they're just trying to sell an LMIA for immigration services, okay? So thanks again for listening. I know it was long, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I really appreciate all the support, so thank you.